Supreme Court has just released a major decision involving President Trump's tariff policies and whether the president exceeded his authority with sweeping reciprocal tariffs on other nations, the centerpiece of his economic agenda. Let's get right to ABC's senior Washington correspondent Devin Dwyer, who covers the Supreme Court for us. Devin, your thoughts?
Kira, this is one of the most significant decisions on presidential power in decades. The Supreme Court, just moments ago, in a 6-3 decision authored by Chief Justice John Roberts, invalidated most of President.
The Supreme Court of the United States has just delivered a thunderous blow that has shattered President Donald Trump's entire economic agenda in a single devastating ruling, leaving his signature trade policies in ruins and sending shockwaves through the nation and the world. On April 7, 2026, in a decisive 6-3 emergency order, the justices declared that Trump lacked any legal authority to impose his sweeping tariffs on China, Canada, and Mexico, ruling that his aggressive use of emergency powers was flatly unconstitutional and ordering the entire regime to halt immediately with no room for delay or negotiation. The final word from the highest court in the land was crystal clear: stop it now or face the full consequences of defying the Constitution itself. Trump's reaction was instantaneous and explosive, a public meltdown that laid bare the depth of his panic as he took to Truth Social, lashing out at the justices in a tirade of fury, calling them weak, accusing them of betraying America, and even hinting darkly that he might defy their order outright. But everyone watching knew the truth. This was the Supreme Court speaking, the ultimate authority on constitutional matters, and they had just told the President of the United States that his core economic strategy, the very foundation of his return to power, was illegal from the start. This wasn't just some minor setback or a technical ruling on the margins. This was the complete obliteration of Trump's economic vision, the one he had campaigned on so fiercely, the one built around tariffs as a blunt force weapon to punish adversaries, resurrect American manufacturing, force better trade deals, and flood government coffers with revenue. For months, he had wielded these tariffs like a hammer, slapping them on imports from key trading partners under the banner of national security and emergency powers, promising they would bring jobs flooding back and make America dominant again. But even before the court stepped in, the policy was unraveling in spectacular fashion. The stock market had hemorrhaged $4 trillion in value amid the chaos of Trump's tariff wars and the fierce international retaliation that followed, wiping out retirement accounts, crushing investment portfolios, and leaving businesses paralyzed with uncertainty about what new duties might slam down next. Families across the heartland watched their savings evaporate. Small manufacturers struggled to source parts without costs skyrocketing, and farmers stared at empty fields because export markets had slammed shut in response. It was economic carnage on a scale that few could have imagined, and now the Supreme Court had ruled that none of it had ever been legal to begin with. Chief Justice John Roberts, the conservative leader of the court and someone Trump had once viewed as an ideological ally, penned the majority opinion that cut to the bone. In clear, unflinching language, Roberts declared Trump's tariff policy legally insupportable, a stunning rebuke that went far beyond mild disagreement. He explained that the Constitution grants Congress, not the President, the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations under Article 1, Section 8, and while some delegation is possible, it is not unlimited. Trump had leaned heavily on the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, claiming it gave him broad authority to act in crises, but Roberts dismantled that argument piece by piece. The law requires a genuine national emergency, an unusual and extraordinary threat, and a direct link between the powers used and the problem at hand. Trump's declarations fell short on every count. Trade imbalances with China had existed for decades. Border issues with Mexico were serious, but hardly the kind of sudden catastrophe that justified rewriting the entire tariff code. Even if emergencies existed, the act simply did not authorize the kind of massive, across-the-board trade wars Trump had launched. It was designed for targeted financial sanctions, not for upending global supply chains or punishing entire economies. Roberts made it plain: Trump had exceeded his authority, usurped Congress's role, and violated the constitutional order. The tariffs had to end, not gradually, not after appeals, but right then and there. The economic fallout from those tariffs had been brutal and undeniable, something the opinion acknowledged head-on. Lower courts had already documented the $4 trillion in market losses, the disrupted supply chains, the higher prices squeezing American consumers. the jobs vanishing as businesses could no longer plan or compete. Roberts noted that while economic harm alone doesn't determine constitutionality, it underscores why limits on presidential power matter so deeply, because when one person overreaches, real people suffer. Retirees who had counted on steady 401k growth saw decades of planning wiped out overnight. Factory workers in the Midwest faced sudden layoffs when imported components became unaffordable. Farmers in the Midwest and South lost billions in soybean and pork exports as China and others hit back with their own tariffs, turning once thriving rural communities into pockets of despair. The human cost was heartbreaking: families tightening belts, small towns losing their economic anchors, a sense of betrayal settling over the very voters who had placed their hopes in Trump's tough guy trade rhetoric. And now the court was saying it had all been for nothing, built on a foundation of illegal overreach. What made this ruling even more seismic was the lineup of the justices. It wasn't a liberal bloc overruling a conservative president. This was a 6-3 decision where Roberts was joined by Trump's own appointees, Brett Kavanaugh and Amy Coney Barrett. These were the justices Trump had handpicked, celebrated, and expected to shield him. Yet they stood with the majority in saying his actions crossed a constitutional line. The three most conservative voices, Justices Thomas, Alito, and Gorsuch, dissented, arguing for broader presidential latitude in foreign affairs and national security, insisting courts should defer to the executive on such matters and that tariffs had long been a tool of diplomacy. But even their dissent didn't fully endorse Trump's specific moves. It spoke more to general principles of executive power. The majority, however, drew a firm boundary. No president, no matter how urgent he claims the situation is, can simply ignore the law and rewrite trade policy on a whim. Kavanaugh and Barrett's votes carried special weight, a quiet but powerful signal that even those elevated by Trump would not rubber stamp illegal actions. It shattered the illusion that he had stacked the court in his favor, proving that the Constitution still binds everyone, including the man in the Oval Office. Trump's panic unfolded in real time, raw and unfiltered. Within minutes of the ruling dropping, his True Social feed erupted with posts attacking the justices by name, branding them weak, disloyal, and accused of aiding China at America's expense. He raged that they were destroying American jobs, undermining his efforts to protect workers, and betraying the country he had sworn to lead. There were dark hints of defiance, suggestions that he might simply ignore the order and keep the tariffs in place, as if the Supreme Court were just another obstacle he could bully past. But the reality sank in quickly. Defying the court would trigger an immediate constitutional crisis, grounds for impeachment and removal that even his most loyal allies in Congress could not ignore. This wasn't a lower court he could dismiss. This was the final arbiter of the law, and every legal expert, every constitutional scholar, every seasoned observer knew the president had no choice but to comply. The markets sensed it too, reacting with explosive relief. The S&P 500 surged 3% in a single day, hundreds of billions in value flooding back as investors celebrated the end of the uncertainty that had gripped the economy for months. Businesses could finally plan again, supply chains could begin to stabilize, and the fear of endless escalation faded. Internationally, the response was swift and hopeful. China announced it would pause its retaliatory tariffs, opening the door to negotiations and signaling that the destructive cycle of tit-for-tat duties might finally break. The European Union, Canada, and Mexico followed suit, indicating they were ready to suspend their countermeasures once Trump rescinded the orders. American farmers, long battered by lost markets in China, dared to hope they could ship soybeans and pork again without punitive barriers. Manufacturers breathed easier, knowing they could source materials without artificial cost spikes that had driven some operations overseas or out of business entirely. The global economy, which had been teetering under the weight of Trump's trade war, showed the first glimmers of recovery, all because the Supreme Court had stepped in and declared the whole enterprise unlawful. That 3% market jump wasn't just numbers on a screen. It was a verdict from the people who actually bet real money on economic outcomes. Investors had watched $4 trillion vanish under Trump's policies, and now watched hundreds of billions return the moment those policies were struck down. It was a devastating judgment on the entire tariff experiment, proof that markets viewed it as a self-inflicted wound rather than a bold masterstroke. The fiscal implications were equally catastrophic and added another layer of ruin to Trump's agenda. His entire economic plan had hinged on tariff revenue to offset tax cuts and new spending, but the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget had already begun recalculating, projecting a staggering $1.7 trillion revenue shortfall stretching through 2036 now that those tariffs were gone for good. The deficit was set to balloon even larger, the national debt climbing faster without any backup plan in place. Trump had sold the tariffs as a brilliant two-for-one, punish foreign competitors and fill the treasury at the same time. Instead, they had delivered economic pain without the promised windfall, and the court's ruling had vaporized even that illusion. Republicans heading into future elections suddenly faced the nightmare of defending massive deficits with no coherent strategy to address them, forced to explain why a policy that destroyed $4 trillion in wealth had also failed to deliver the revenue Trump had bragged about.
It was political poison compounding the human suffering already felt in communities across the country. This single ruling didn't exist in isolation. It landed amid a presidency already buckling under multiple crises, accelerating what many were calling a complete political collapse. War crimes accusations swirling around threats to Iranian infrastructure, international sanctions piling up from allies tired of American unpredictability, the fallout from empty ultimatums abroad, suppressed files in high-profile investigations, internal purges at federal agencies, a standing criminal conviction, and court blocks on policy after policy. All of it converged with this economic body blow. The image of Trump as the ultimate dealmaker, the economic genius who understood business like no one else, lay in tatters.
The Supreme Court had exposed the truth. His trade policy was not just misguided but illegal, built on a deliberate overreach of presidential power that ignored the clear lines drawn by the Constitution. Democrats now held ironclad ammunition for impeachment proceedings, citing the president's failure to faithfully execute the laws and his months-long violation of congressional authority. Even hints of defiance from Trump only made the case stronger, turning potential removal from office into a real possibility if he chose confrontation over compliance. For Trump's base, the betrayal cut especially deep. These weren't abstract policy debates affecting distant elites. This was Iowa farmers shut out of Chinese markets, Wisconsin manufacturers unable to afford essential imports, Pennsylvania factory workers watching their plants idle because of cost explosions they had been told would never happen. Many had voted for Trump precisely because he promised to fight for them against unfair trade, and now they learned the fight had been illegal all along, that the Supreme Court had to intervene to protect the very system he claimed to champion. Some supporters remained fiercely loyal, unwilling to question their champion no matter the evidence. But others began to waver, staring at depleted retirement accounts and struggling local economies, wondering how the man they trusted could have caused such widespread harm through actions the highest court deemed unconstitutional. The political ground was shifting beneath Trump's feet, with even some Republicans in competitive districts quietly distancing themselves, acknowledging in private that the tariffs had been a mistake while hoping voters wouldn't tie them too closely to the wreckage. The legal destruction was total and irreversible. The Supreme Court had not issued a temporary stay or invited further review. It had permanently invalidated the tariff regime, ruling that Trump had violated both the International Emergency Economic Powers Act and the Constitution's allocation of commerce powers. There was no higher court to appeal to, no procedural loophole to exploit. Congress could theoretically pass new legislation granting such authority, but the political momentum had swung hard against it, with Democrats controlling the narrative and even many Republicans recoiling from the economic damage already inflicted. This created clear documented grounds for impeachment, rooted in the president's sworn duty to uphold the laws and his demonstrated failure to do so. If Trump attempted defiance, even his staunchest congressional allies would face enormous pressure to support removal, because allowing one branch to ignore another would unravel the separation of powers that has defined American governance for over 2 centuries. The stakes were nothing less than the survival of constitutional order itself. Economically, the vindication for Trump's critics was overwhelming and immediate. The market's 3% surge was more than a rebound. It was a collective sigh of relief from investors who had long warned that tariff wars hurt America more than they helped. $4 trillion in lost wealth, retirement dreams deferred, college funds diminished, innovation capital squandered, stood as a grim monument to the policy's failure. Now, with the chaos ending, supply chains could heal, exports could resume, and American businesses could compete on more level ground. China's pause on retaliatory measures offered a lifeline to farmers and exporters who had suffered the most. The European Union and North American partners signaled willingness to de-escalate, hinting at a return to normalized trade that could stabilize prices and restore jobs. Voters would feel it in their daily lives, 401k statements climbing again, grocery bills easing as import costs normalize, factories reopening or expanding without the artificial burdens Trump had imposed. It was proof positive that ending the illegal tariffs was not just legally correct but economically wise, a judgment delivered by the very markets Trump so often cited as proof of his success. Politically, the ruling accelerated everything already unraveling. Trump's brand as the unbreakable strongman, the protector of American workers, the master negotiator who would never back down, had been exposed as built on sand. The Supreme Court had documented his overreach in painstaking detail, handing opponents a blueprint for campaign ads that would replay the $4 trillion losses, the market celebration at the ruling, and the fiscal black hole left behind. Republicans would struggle to defend the indefensible, forced to explain why they had backed policies now declared unconstitutional, why they had supported measures that enriched no one but foreign adversaries through retaliation. Trump's base, already strained by other controversies, faced a moment of reckoning, loyalty to a leader who had governed outside the law or allegiance to the Constitution and the economic stability it was meant to protect. The compounding crises, foreign policy missteps, domestic scandals, institutional distrust, painted a portrait of a presidency defined by chaos, excess, and legal disregard. In the end, the story of April 7, 2026 is one of constitutional reckoning. The Supreme Court stepped forward at a critical moment and reminded the nation that no president stands above the law, that emergency powers are not a blank check, and that the separation of powers exists to prevent exactly the kind of unilateral overreach Trump had attempted. Trump's immediate panic, his attacks on the justices, his hints of defiance, all of it underscored how completely his economic house of cards had collapsed. Yet the markets rebounded, international tensions eased, and the promise of recovery glimmered on the horizon. American workers, families, and businesses began to glimpse a path forward without the constant threat of tariff-induced turmoil. The $4 trillion lost would not magically reappear overnight, but the bleeding had stopped and healing could begin. The fiscal shortfall loomed large, demanding new thinking from leaders of both parties, but at least the illusion of easy revenue from illegal policies had been stripped away. This ruling stands as a historic marker, one that future generations will study as an example of the judiciary fulfilling its role as a check on executive ambition. It destroyed Trump's central economic narrative, demolished his claims of unparalleled competence in trade, and laid bare the limits of presidential power in a way no lower court or congressional debate ever could. For those who had warned from the beginning that tariffs were a blunt and dangerous tool when misused, it was vindication wrapped in relief. For Trump supporters who had placed their faith in his vision, it was a painful awakening to the reality that good intentions do not override constitutional boundaries. The president who had promised to put America first had instead pursued a policy that the Supreme Court ruled put the Constitution last, and the nation was now forced to confront the consequences while searching for a more stable path ahead. The drama of that day, the raw emotion in Trump's outbursts, the quiet satisfaction in boardrooms and trading floors as the ruling landed, the quiet hope stirring in farm towns and factory cities, all of it coalesced into a moment that felt larger than any single policy dispute. It was about the soul of American governance, the balance of power that prevents any one person from wielding unchecked authority, and the economic well-being of millions who had borne the brunt of decisions made in haste and without proper legal grounding. As the tariffs began to unwind under court order, businesses recalibrated, investors regained confidence, and global partners extended olive branches, the country stood at a crossroads. The Supreme Court had spoken with finality, and in doing so, it had not only ended one man's illegal experiment, but had reaffirmed the enduring strength of the institutions designed to protect the people from precisely such excesses. The road to recovery would be long, the political fallout would echo for years, but the immediate verdict was unmistakable. Trump's tariff regime was finished, his economic agenda lay in ruins, and the Constitution had prevailed in dramatic, unforgettable fashion. The American experiment, tested once again, had held. 1. 9 Skeppers